The roar of the waves drowns out the beat of the drums. Masts bend, ropes are taut, like strings, ready to snap. A storm over the Mediterranean Sea tears the sky, and thousands of legionaries pray to gods whom they never asked for mercy. But who prays louder? The warriors or the sailors? For on board these ships their fates are intertwined into one, the fate of Rome. And while the sea hurls triremes into the abyss, one question will torment us until the end of this story. How did people, accustomed to land, endure the sea's fury? Historians write that during the Punic Wars the Roman fleet reached an incredible scale, more than 300 ships and over 100,000 people on board. Polybius noted that during the campaign to Sicily, a storm off Cape Camarina destroyed almost the entire fleet. This was not a battle, but a fight with nature, and the Romans lost. On these vessels were not only rowers, but also legionaries, land fighters who were temporarily turned into sailors, as if tigers were forced to swim. Rome called these warriors classiari, soldiers of the fleet, who were often thrown into the marine abyss without experience or training. Imagine you are standing on the deck of a quinquerem, a 50-meter colossus with 5 rows of oars. The air is thick with tar, sweat and fear. A wave crashes onto the bow like a battering ram, and salty foam lashes your face. Below, in the dark holds, hundreds of rowers sit 3 to an oar, tied to benches so they wouldn't be washed overboard. They hear the ship creak, as if a giant groans in pain. The term that defined the order of movement of such vessels was ordoremorum, the formation of oars. It set the rhythm for the entire machine, where every hand and every muscle served one breath. Break the rhythm, and the ship breaks, like a bone under a blow. A storm for a Roman sailor was not just a disaster, it was a test of his body and spirit. Tacitus wrote that seasickness broke legionaries more severely than any wound. Nausea, dehydration, fear, all this deprived even veterans who had gone through dozens of land campaigns of strength. And yet the Romans did not abandon the seas. They saw in them not chaos, but a path to power, to glory, to the bread of Egypt and the gold of the East. It was the sea that was meant to bind the empire, but first they had to learn to endure it. Excavations in Ostia, Rome's ancient port, revealed amphorae found in sunken warehouses, their contents frozen, as if time itself, wheat, oil, tar. All this traveled along routes where every storm could turn into a tragedy. And behind every barrel stood people who had to fight not only the sea, but also themselves. A legionary, accustomed to marching under the scorching sun, at sea became a prisoner of the pitching. He could not lean on the ground, could not straighten up under the weight of his shield. Here his enemy was not iron, but the wave. Plutarch wrote that sailors suffering from seasickness prayed not for salvation, but for death, because their bodies ceased to obey. And yet, when the storm receded, these same people again took up their oars, dried their cloaks, and moved on, because duty to Rome was greater than fear. They were taught to endure pain, but the sea taught them to endure helplessness. When the sky tore open over the Mediterranean Sea, the Romans understood for the first time. The empire's power was measured not only by the number of swords, but also by the number of people capable of surviving a storm. But the sea forgives neither bravery nor discipline, and the next wave was already rising on the horizon, the one that forever changed the fate of the Roman fleet. Dawn over Ostia, not the start of a day, but a test of nerves. Work bustles on the quays. Overseers shouts, the creak of winches, the smell of tar and fresh resin. Here, among hundreds of ships, legionaries become not fighters, but porters, carpenters, rowers. Everyone knows, what awaits them beyond the horizon is more terrifying than any enemy, for the sea accepts no oaths. Historians write that before major campaigns, such as the expedition to Carthage in 256 BC, Rome prepared entire flotillas of hundreds of ships. According to various sources, up to 30,000 warriors became classiari, soldiers of the fleet. These were the same legionaries, simply dressed in short tunics and sandals, capable of clinging to the deck even in a downpour. Their task was to fight after landing, but first they had to survive on the ship. Supplies were taken with ounce-level precision. Per person, 2 amphorae of water, 1.5 pounds of hardtack, a little wine, and a piece of salted pork. All this was packed into barrels, which then served as seats during a storm. Archaeologists found remnants of such barrels with carved names of legionaries in Ostia and Carthage, as if they were signing their coffins in advance. The main person on the ship was not the captain, but the navarchus, a naval commander, most often a freedman with sailing experience gained during the war with Carthage. He was subordinate to the praefectus classis, the fleet prefect, usually from the equestrian order. The prefect was Rome's eyes at sea. He was responsible not only for discipline, but also for the souls of the men. Fear reigned on the decks, a fear that could not be shown. Seasickness was considered a disgrace, for a soldier losing control over his body also loses his honor. Tacitus wrote that some commanders forced legionaries to remain on their feet even in the strongest storm, to prevent weakness from overcoming them, but their bodies betrayed their will. They were violently ill, their muscles cramped, and their eyes teared up from the salty wind. The roar of waves, the cry of gulls, the smell of rotting fish and tar, all this mingled with the rhythm of the drums, setting the pace for the rowers. This sound was called pulsus rimorum, the beat of the oars. It beat in the heart of every soldier, like the pulse of the empire itself. Break it, and all order would collapse. To endure, legionaries established their own order. They checked their straps, greased the oars, and repeated signals. Commands were given by flags and trumpets, for the human voice drowned in the roar of the sea. One wrong signal could cost hundreds of lives. Those who went to sea for the first time often lost consciousness from the pitching. They were laid in the lower holds where the air was thick with stench and dampness. The heat there was like in a forge, and only a rare ray of light pierced through the hatches. In these dark compartments, the sea seemed alive. It groaned, pushed, whispered through the planks. Warriors, accustomed to land, to steps on the solid stone of roads, suddenly found themselves prisoners of the shifting element. But it was precisely here that a new strength of Rome was forged, the ability to cling not to the land, but to rhythm, to order, to discipline. When the trumpet signal announced the raising of anchors, every heart beat like a drum. Heavy anchors of lead and wood, called anchorae, were raised by hand, amidst shouts and the clanking of chains. This was the moment when the path back was already closed. From this moment, the legionary ceased to be a warrior of the land. He became part of the ship, its living body. And when the first waves rose off the Cape of Sicily, the sea seemed to decide to test everyone who dared to challenge its abyss. The Romans did not yet know that a storm awaited them ahead, one that no captain would survive. But at that moment, looking at the horizon, they felt it was not just a voyage beginning, but a battle with chaos itself. The sun disappeared suddenly, as if someone had covered the sky with a leaden blanket. A heavy smell of ozone portended disaster. The sea, calm just moments before, began to breathe like a beast preparing to pounce. The Roman fleet, hundreds of ships, stretched for miles, and not a single person knew that a night awaited them ahead, one that would forever change the fate of those who survived. Historians write that the storm of Cape Camarina in 254 BC became one of the greatest disasters for the Roman fleet. More than 150 ships vanished into the abyss. Polybius noted, the destruction was so sudden that they didn't even have time to furl the sails. It wasn't a battle, it was a sentence. Chaos reigned on the decks. Legionaries accustomed to orderly formations couldn't keep their footing. Foam lashed their faces, oars snapped like reeds. The Corvus, the heavy boarding bridge for which the Romans were famous in naval battles, now became a death trap. Its iron beak pulled the ship down like an anchor. The sea struck with such force that even experienced navarchi lost their bearings. The order, amputate corvum, cut off the corvus, echoed throughout the fleet. Hundreds of soldiers hacked at ropes, saving at least part of the ships, but the storm was already swallowing them, one trireme after another. Those below, rowers, slaves, recruits, heard the water break in the hull. The creak of wood sounded like groans. With each wave strike, the hold filled with icy water, smelling of salt and death. People tried to bail it out with their helmets, but the torrent was too strong. The term that described this moment of losing control was iactura, the forced jettisoning of cargo to save the ship. Everything was thrown overboard: ballistae, weapons, supplies. Sometimes even the living, so that the rest might survive. This was not an order, it was panic in which Roman discipline cracked like planks under the onslaught of a wave. The roar, the darkness, the screams all merged into one sound where the human voice drowned in the elemental fury. Warriors prayed to Neptune and Jupiter, swearing they would never go to sea again. Some cut their palms and threw blood into the waves, an ancient rite of appeasing the gods, mentioned by Livy. But the sea knew no mercy. Rowers, tied to their benches, could not escape. Their bodies were found later, when the storm subsided, contorted, as if still holding an oar. Legionaries on deck fought not only the waves, but also terror. Seasickness turned into madness. The body lost balance. Eyes couldn't distinguish the horizon, and it seemed as if the very earth had disappeared from beneath their feet forever. At dawn, the survivors saw the sea strewn with wreckage, like a battlefield. Out of 150 ships, according to various sources, no more than 50 survived. The rest went into the depths along with thousands of soldiers. No enemy had inflicted such a loss on Rome. Plutarch wrote that after this storm, the Romans realized for the first time the sea does not obey the laws of the empire. But, as it always happened, instead of fear, they chose perseverance. Within a few years, they again built a fleet, larger, heavier, stronger. At the site where those ships perished, archaeologists found bronze parts covered with corals, fragments of rowing oars, and remnants of helmets. Each discovery was like a voice from the deep. We were here. We tried to survive. When the storm receded, the surviving legionaries lay on the decks, exhausted, trembling, with pale faces. But in their eyes was reflected not fear, but a realization. If they had survived this, they would survive anything. The sea had cleansed them of weakness. Now they knew the price of survival. And ahead of them lay land, but not salvation, because even after the storm, the sea did not release those who had once looked into its abyss. Night covered the Mediterranean Sea so swiftly as if darkness itself had decided to join the battle. The storm intensified with every gust of wind. Waves rose higher than the masts, and it seemed as if the sea had decided to overturn the sky. People on the decks screamed, but the wind tore the words from their mouths, not allowing them even to die with a prayer on their lips. At this moment, every legionary understood. There was no enemy more terrifying than the elements, where there was neither a front line nor a possibility to retreat. Historians wrote that during this storm, the Romans encountered something that no regulation, no marching order had foreseen. Polybius described how captains tried to maintain formation, lining up the ships, but the waves broke the formation faster than orders could be given. Discipline, which had become Rome's pride, lost its meaning. Each ship was now a separate word, a separate tragedy. At the heart of this abyss stood the quinqueremes, enormous vessels, the pride of the Roman fleet. Their might became their undoing. 5 rows of oars meant that the hull was heavier and less stable. When a wave rolled in from the side, the entire ship capsized, and hundreds of bodies, chained to the oars, fell with it. This was called catastropha navalis, a naval catastrophe. Those who survived below tried to climb up through the hatches, but they were swept away by the backwash. One Roman chronicler wrote, "People disappeared as if pulled by the hand of Neptune himself. Those who remained on deck clung to the masts, to the ropes, to their comrades, anything they could grasp. Salty foam blinded them. Their skin cracked from the cold, and breathing became a struggle." The fleet prefect, the prefectus classis, should have given the signal to withdraw, but the lighthouse lights were not visible. Trumpets did not sound. Flags were lost in the darkness. At this moment, command ceased to exist. People acted on instinct. One ship drifted at the mercy of chance, another turned against the wind, a fatal error, for the sail filled and capsized the vessel instantly. Warriors, weakened by seasickness, could no longer hold their weapons. Their bodies trembled, their faces were green like patinated copper. They tore at themselves until they bled, trying to hold on, and many went mad. Tacitus wrote that seasickness is capable of driving a man to madness faster than the fear of death. And indeed, in those who survived, the shadow of that night lived on for a long time. The screams subsided when strength abandoned everyone. Only the roar of the sea remained. One legionary who had lost his shield clung to a broken oar. The water pulled him down, but he still whispered an oath of loyalty to Rome. His voice drowned in the storm, but the words sounded like a prayer. These people did not surrender even to the sea. Amidst the raging waves, lightning flashed, illuminating a terrible scene. Dozens of ships, capsized, with masts sticking out of the water like crosses. At that moment, the storm ceased to be merely a natural phenomenon. It became a symbol that even an empire that had subjugated half the world could not control the elements. The term sailors used for the moment when a storm reached its maximum force was procella maxima. This is the point where everything is decided. Either the ship breaks or the spirit. And it was here, in the center of the storm, that not iron, but human will was forged. Some ships tried to withstand by cutting down their masts. Without sails, they became lighter but more helpless. People rowed by hand, bailing water with their helmets. Someone sang, so as not to hear the roar of the wind. Song was the only thing that still obeyed man. Polybius wrote that the storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of hell, when sky and sea changed places. Those who survived the storm later recounted that the sun on the 4th morning seemed like a sign from the gods, but not salvation, because, when the light returned, it illuminated not the sea, but a cemetery. Later, on the shores of Sicily, fishermen found bodies in Roman armor. They were washed ashore by the waves for weeks. Swords, helmets, wooden tablets with names were found in the sand, and on each was a trace of salt and time. However, this storm was not the end. From its ruins, Rome took not fear, but a lesson. The empire lost ships, but gained knowledge. The sea can be conquered not by force, but by reason. Since then, every new fleet was built differently, taking into account winds, currents, and the weight of sails. But at that moment, in the heart of the Procella Maxima, no one thought about it. People simply held on, to life, to memory, to the hope that the storm would end before they themselves did. And in those fingers clinging to the wreckage, a new naval power of Rome was already being born. Morning came without the cries of gulls. The sea lay motionless, as if weary of its own fury. Everywhere were wrecks, oars, planks, shreds of sails. Salty foam quietly leapt at the shores of Sicily, where waves cast out bodies. The faces of the dead legionaries were whiter than marble, their eyes open, as if they still couldn't believe the storm had finally subsided. Polybius wrote that after the storm, no more than a fifth of the Roman fleet survived. More than 100,000 people perished or were declared missing. No one counted the rower slaves. Their bodies remained in the depths, chained to the oars. This catastrophe became more terrible for Rome than any battle. But in it was born what would later make Rome the master of the seas. The surviving legionaries, washed ashore, could not immediately stand up. Their bodies were exhausted, stomachs constricted from days without food, skin burned by salt. But when they looked up, before them lay the shore, a symbol of salvation and shame simultaneously. For Rome did not tolerate defeats, even from the gods. One of the surviving officers, according to Livy's records, told his soldiers, "We lost the fleet, but not our honor." These words became the beginning of a revival. Within a few months, the Senate allocated funds for a new shipyard in Ostia. The city filled with the sounds of hammers and saws. The sea took men. Rome responded with ships. The Romans re-evaluated everything, from ship design to logistics. The old, heavy quinqueremes were replaced by lighter triremes, capable of withstanding storms. Sails became shorter, hulls wider, to hold more steadily on the waves. Thus, a new type of ship was born, the Liburna. It was smaller, faster, more agile. Its name would later become a symbol of Roman naval power. This transition from heaviness to mobility became a metaphor for the empire itself. The sea taught the Romans what war could not: humility before nature. Now every legionary knew neither skill nor discipline would save them from the elements if they didn't learn to listen to its breath. In documents from the time of Augustus, the term disciplina maritima, naval training, is found. Its foundation became that very survival in the storm. Now legionaries were taught not only formation and sword, but also how to distribute weight on deck, how to secure cargo, how to hold on during pitching. Seasickness was no longer considered a weakness. It became a test, mandatory for every recruit. Archaeological findings confirm these changes. In Ostia and Misenum, remains of training pools have been discovered, where sailors were taught to row in place to the sound of drums. On the walls were carved the words "Durare sicut mare," endure like the sea. But not all lessons could be learned. Many veterans of that storm could no longer look at the water. They avoided docks, lived far from the sea, and closed their eyes at the sound of thunder. Plutarch wrote that the storm left a mark on their souls that time could not erase. Nevertheless, it was these very people who had passed through the hell of waves who became mentors to a new generation of sailors. They taught the young not to fear pitching, not to tear sails in the wind, not to scream during a storm. They said, if the sea wants to take, it will take, but if you accept it, it will live you life. For the empire, this storm became a lesson in resilience. After it, Rome never again treated the sea as an enemy. It became its ally. Terrifying, unpredictable, but necessary. For without the seas, Rome would not have been able to hold its provinces, deliver grain from Egypt, or protect trade from pirates. Thus, a new fleet was born. Not of wood and bronze, but of human experience. Every ship was now built with the memory of the fallen. Every voyage to sea was accompanied by a ritual. A drop of wine was poured into the water, a gift to Neptune. Archaeologists found amphorae with inscriptions "Pro vita," for life. These words became a maritime charm, and yet, despite the new strength, the memory of that storm lived in everyone who stepped onto the deck. Every wave strike reminded them. The sea does not forgive overconfidence. It grants passage, but demands respect. At sunset on that day, when the storm finally subsided, the surviving legionaries lit bonfires on the shore. The fire reflected in the waves, and it seemed as if the sea was answering them with its own light. In this silent dialogue, the entire history of Rome, pride, suffering, and the eternal striving to conquer that which does not yield to power. But the true revelation still lay ahead. For years later, the storm would remind them of itself again, and force the empire to remember the price at which it learned to stay afloat. Decades passed, but the roar of that storm continued to echo in the heart of Rome. Even when the empire flourished under Augustus, even when the legions stood on the shores of Britannia, the sea still remembered those who perished in its depths. Every ship departing from Ostia carried with it not only cargo and warriors, but also the shadow of that night when Rome first learned that not everything in the world obeyed its will. In the training camps for new sailors, they now began with stories of the storm of Camarina. The old Classiari uttered these words with respect, like the name of a fallen commander. They said, "The sea is not an enemy. It is an examiner." These simple words became part of Roman naval doctrine, defining the fleet's conduct for centuries. Historians note that it was precisely after that catastrophe that Rome became not merely an owner of a fleet, but a maritime power in the full sense. The creation of permanent bases, Misenum, Ravenna, Baiae, was a response to that lesson. Here appeared the first barracks for sailors, provision warehouses, reserve sails. All of this was born not out of pride, but out of the memory of defeat. The fleet prefect was now considered not just a commander, but a guardian of the sea. His oath began with the words, "May the gods grant me reason in the storm." This title, Praefectus Classis, became a symbol not of power, but of responsibility. For he who commands the fleet commands the lives of thousands of people who have entrusted themselves to the elements. Archaeological findings confirm that by the end of the 1st century AD, the legionaries' maritime life had become commonplace. In their homes, marine amulets, shells, and dolphin-shaped charms, symbols of survival, were found. and in inscriptions on stones the word supervixit, he survived, often appeared. It became an honorable mark, no less important than a medal for valor. But beneath this outward brilliance lay the memory of pain. Seasickness, once considered a weakness, was now studied and treated. Doctors of that time advised drinking wine with vinegar and keeping one's gaze on the horizon, the first known remedy against pitching. Celsus mentioned that resistance to the sea was now considered as much a virtue as skill with a sword. And yet, even with experience and knowledge, every storm remained a test. The Romans learned to read the sky, navigate by the stars, and account for wind direction. But when the wind howled in the rigging, even hardened veterans felt the ancient fear rise in their chests. For the sea reminded them, everything built by human hands can disappear in a single night. Plutarch wrote that sailors often performed sacrifices after storms, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. They threw bread, wine, sometimes bronze coins into the water, a sign of acknowledging that life was returned not by themselves, but by the will of the gods. In these simple rituals resonated wisdom born of suffering. One cannot conquer what must be accepted. The sea became a mirror of the empire. When wrong grew, the fleet multiplied. When wrong trembled, ships sank. And eventually, when the empire began to crumble under the onslaught of barbarians, the seas reclaimed their own. Bases emptied, ships rotted in docks, and only storms still battered the shores, as a reminder, everything returns to the elements. Modern historians, studying the traces of ancient shipwrecks off the coast of Sicily, found something astonishing. Amphorae with the symbol of an eagle, bronze helmets overgrown with corals. On some of them, scratches were visible, letters carved by hand before death, SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome, a symbol of power, and a symbol of futility. And yet, in this story there is no defeat, there is overcoming. For everyone who survived the storm became living proof that a person is capable of enduring even what they cannot comprehend. The Romans learned not to fear the seas, but to live with them. Their fleets survived centuries, and even after the fall of the empire, the principles of disciplina maritima, naval training, formed the basis of Europe's maritime traditions. When we look at the calm surface of the Mediterranean Sea today, it seems peaceful. But beneath this surface lies the history of thousands of lives given to the winds. Every breath of a wave is a memory of those who rowed against fate, who fought seasickness, fatigue, and the terror of the boundless expanse. And now, knowing all this, one can ask, could we have endured, finding ourselves on the deck of that quinquereme in the midst of a storm, when everything around collapses and only loyalty remains, to Rome, to duty, to oneself? For, perhaps, the strength of Rome lay not in its swords and not in its legions, but in a person's ability not to surrender even when the elements demand capitulation. The sea took the best, but it was they who made the empire eternal. Because where a ship breaks, character is born, and in every wave breaking on the shore, the echo of that ancient oath still resonates, durare sicut mare, endure like the sea.